Hello and welcome to the Alternative Path. This week's guest is somebody who I have communicated with on LinkedIn. I've really engaged with some of his posts and some of the things he talks about on the platform. His name is Roger Mitchell. Now, Roger is the head teacher of Ripple Primary School. And one of the things I'd like to go into today with Roger is he talks about his school being an emotionally available school. So, Roger, great to have you on. Just
Yeah,
start
thanks.
by
Nice
giving
to be on.
us a bit of an intro of who Roger is.
Okay, so what can I say? I've been working in Barking and Dagenham. It's the sixth most deprived borough in the country, and I've been here since I was a baby teacher back in 1988. I started, so 36 years at the end of this year it'll be. 20 of those years as head teacher at Ripple Primary School, which started off as a three-form entry junior school. And then amalgamated with the infant school, which was on the same site but under separate governance, and then expanded onto a second site with the expansion in pupil population to become a five-form entry primary school on two sites. And we currently have 950 pupils, very diverse. So as well as being a very deprived area, there's also 86% EAL, but that's split across 72 different languages at the moment. So, yeah, a very, very diverse school, but a wonderful, rich community.
Wow. I mean, for anyone everybody knows education as a sector, but that 900 pupils in primary is a large primary school. So,
Mm.
yeah, I can. With that naturally will come a huge amount of diversity. So yeah, I mean, there's so much I could go into and sort of questions I could ask Roger, but one of a real key topic I'd love to get into with yourself is you're really vocal about Ripple Primary School being an emotionally available school. So can you kind of give us a bit of an insight as to what that means and how that kind of journey has kind of progressed over your time there?
Yeah, sure. Right. Well, 20 years ago, when I first arrived at the school, it was a very different place. It was quite a fragmented school. The head teacher had not been well at all for a long time, and I took over as acting head in the July of 2005. And he sadly passed away in the September. But there'd been no real leadership in the school. It got very fragmented and very bitchy and clicky, and nobody went in the staff room. It just didn't feel like a nice place to be. And my deputy, who arrived at about the same time as me, just said to me, "What are we going to do? Where do we start?" And I responded, arguably quite naively at the time, that we'd start with the grown-ups and that we'd smother them with love and kindness, and that the people who wanted to be happy would stay, and the people who didn't want to be happy wouldn't be able to take it, and they'd just go away and be unhappy somewhere else. And it's interesting because just taking that viewpoint of starting with kindness, and it's astonishing how many people who, to be frank, were working at the school didn't even like children at the time, I felt, just decided they didn't want to work with me and they left. And one of the most powerful, I think, tools that I've had in my toolkit for the whole time I've been here is the opportunity to recruit the right people to the school. So I think that's a really important factor. But it was a bit more organised than that. I actually introduced two key underlying principles, which I termed back then, around about 2006, as professional generosity and professional maturity. And professional generosity, my demand was that we maintain both of those things at the highest level at all times. Professional generosity basically means looking out for each other, looking after each other, always giving the benefit of the doubt. And even when it's really challenging, asking yourself why a child, a colleague, another adult in the school has done what they've done before addressing what they've done. So always asking why rather than what. And although we didn't know it at the time, 18, 19 years ago, that essentially, we find out later, is the foundation of trauma-informed practice, looking for the reasons behind the actions and understanding that behaviour is communication of a need, not a need in itself. The other big thing was professional maturity, and that's about professional self-management, my expectations that you do the job until the job's done. Obviously within reason. We have to have work-life balance. But the real, I think, underlying thing with that is it's about doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, not because you're scared of the consequences of doing the wrong thing. And so my example there with the grown-ups in the school would be that my staff mark their books because they need to inform themselves of the next steps for the child. They don't mark their books because they're worried about what I'll say if I do a book look. So those are the two things that started it all off, and we carried those through, and we've been refining those ever since. And slowly over time, you learn about trauma-informed practice. You then learn about adverse childhood experiences. In education, we've only been talking about this stuff probably for about the last, I suppose, 6, 7 years maybe. And also looking goes back a bit further than those two things in education, but an understanding of attachment theory and the impact that has on children. So the idea is that if you get all your staff, and I mean everyone from myself to my governors, to my office staff, to the midday supervisors, the teaching staff, the learning support assistants, the site staff, everybody has undertaken that training and has that understanding of how we deal with children. At that point, you're going to be able to say that we are emotionally informed. Certainly, we're trauma informed. To take that to the next step, you have to move, I think, from trauma informed to trauma responsive. It's all right being able to identify it, it's the what you're going to do about it bit. And that's where we introduce training about what it means to be an emotionally available adult. An emotionally available adult is, just to list a few of the things that we talk about, it's the person who's always available to the child, obviously. It's the person who's genuinely pleased to see them every day, the person they can trust to be consistent and fair, that trust they can learn from their mistakes, and has high expectations of what they're able to achieve, even when they make the mistakes. Somebody they can empathise, with their difficulties, reassures them, keeps them safe, supports them to develop their resilience, but they've got to be resilient themselves. To use that analogy from the airline safety card, you put your own oxygen mask on first, because if you don't do that, you won't be able to help anybody else. And I think the most important thing is the person who maintains a consistent, unconditional, positive regard for them. And that means that you meet the child at their point. It doesn't matter what's going on. You meet the child where they are. You don't demand certain behaviours from them before you engage with them. You actually take it from where it is and work with that. And sometimes, obviously, a new day has to be a fresh start. Sometimes it needs to be the next lesson has to be the fresh start. Some children, at some points, it has to be the next 10 minutes. But we need to make sure that we are always open to what their needs are and never forget that their behaviour is communication of a need, not a need in itself. And we address the needs, which is why we focus on the whys much more than the whats.
I mean, there's so much to go into in there, and I think one of the it's refreshing to hear from my side. You talk about one of the first things, if not quoting you exactly, the first thing you do was address the staffing to be um, all on that same journey with you, but equally all making the staff emotionally available because we all have things at times going on, and it's probably a neglected part of leadership at times in every sector going about making sure our teams are all on the same page and in a good emotional place to then be able to support those that have needs or any need, I think is crucial. But over your time in school, then from the moment you arrived in Ripple Primary, I mean, there's so much in the kind of in the news, in the press, in network groups around the level of need around in young people. So as a school with 900 pupils, how have you how's the landscape changed? I know over the in that whole period, it's going to be so hard to summarize, but for anyone
Yeah.
listening who is interested in this sort of thing? How has it kind of, because I would imagine it's changed loads in that period of time, has it not? So how do you keep on such a high number of staff on, how do you keep that number of staff emotionally available to support such a high number of staff,
I
pupils,
think,
sorry.
yeah, the first thing is you've got to look after your staff, and you've got to make sure your staff look after each other. And a few years back, in fact, it was during COVID that I first started realising that our staff who were scattered away from the school because we were on like a timetable, not coming in every day during that period of time, were really missing being with each other. And one of my learning support supervisors, learning support assistants, actually sent an email out which used the phrase, "I'm really missing my Ripple family." And that just really caught hold. And we got to a place at that point where you could just feel it across the whole school that everybody was looking out for each other and everybody was looking after each other and everybody did care about each other. We don't get it right every time. We don't, we do have our grumbles and mumbles, but they're usually on a pretty low level and we address them professionally very quickly, and they're usually fine. So there is a real feel there for making this place something very special for everybody, not just for the children, but for the whole school community, whether those adults are members of the staff or whether they're members of the families, parents, carers, extended family, and so on. But the first inkling I got of it when I introduced this, and it took a while, of the stuck record going on and the mantras all the time, and the consistency, because that's important. You've got to be consistent. You have to be the role model as the school leader. I think I've already said nothing happens without leadership, and it being the issue of a lack of leadership that has got the school where it was initially where I joined. But you have to be that person the whole time consistently. If there's ever a point where somebody's able to say, "Oh well, Roger didn't do it, why should I?" then that's the thin end of the wedge. That's a problem. So you need to maintain it all the time yourself. And this whole idea of looking out for each other and looking after each other and always asking why before we think about what's happened. I suppose it had been about a year, 18 months of rolling that out and saying that's how we should be dealing with things and dealing with them professionally and kindly towards each other. And a member of staff came up to me and said, "I get it." And I said, "You get what?" And they said, "I understand what you mean properly now. Somebody came up to me this morning and had a go at me about something that really wasn't my fault, something to do with the photocopier or something, I think it was. And I didn't snap back at them. I thought to myself, I don't know what's happened this morning. Perhaps their dog died." And it was a very basic, fundamental way of saying it, but it kind of had dawned on them, and it was very clear of evidence that it dawned on them that they were addressing the whys rather than responding to the whats before addressing the whys. And carrying that attitude through and insisting on it all the time. And you've got to keep those plates spinning the whole time. They don't keep themselves spinning. So that's where the leadership comes in, is the constant reminders, nudges, and so on, to make sure that everybody is continuing with that ethos that keeps it going. And then later on, you formalise it. Now, formalising is what I've already spoke about with the training and establishing what we mean by being emotionally available adults. And it's important, I think, to remember that just one emotionally available adult can secure those relationships with those children and that they need, particularly our most vulnerable children. And frequently that adult's going to be somebody in school. And ideally, if every member of staff in a setting is an emotionally available adult, ready to support children when they need it, then you can call yourself an emotionally available school, because you don't need, for example, a nurture room. We used to have a nurture room, but for us it was a stepping stone to becoming a whole nurture environment. You don't have to go to a particular place to get nurture. Nurture is everywhere. Well-being is everywhere. I think that's really important. And yeah, there are real challenges here. If you think coming back to 2005, when I started, we were on a funding high in education at the time, before everything crashed in about 2008. And we had additional adults in every classroom virtually. We had intervention specialists. We had all sorts going on. We had reading recovery. We had masses happening in school. It is a major challenge now of resourcing. And unfortunately, as budgets shrink in real terms, and they have done significantly over the last certainly 15 years, and I don't see anything coming soon to be able to redress that, because there just isn't any money anywhere. So what you have to do, I think, is change your attitude towards it. We've had to restructure, and the first thing that has to disappear in restructuring is support staff. Your staffing is the only place you make cost savings, and you need a teacher in every classroom. So it's the support staff, unfortunately, that tend to get the brunt of those very, very hard decisions that have to be made sometimes to keep the budget in the right place. But it's a matter of changing your viewpoint. And one thing that I'm very keen to promote in this is not to focus on what we can't do, but focus on what we can do and do it as well as we can under the circumstances. And I've got a little phrase I use for that, which is the greatest barriers to inclusive education reside in our own minds. And if we're prepared to reflect and challenge ourselves, we will creatively, in a lot of situations, be able to find an answer, find a solution.
Yeah, I agree. I love the saying. I'm really, something's really sticking in my mind around like some of the stuff you spoke about, but you made a reference to a member of staff and the other member of staff saying, I get it, I know what you mean. And I often, if I'm, talk about kind of behaviors and so many people have such a negative view on why people behave in a certain way. But we see it through young people. Some of the stuff that young people go through would make most adults become very negative. But I always think of it when I'm driving my car sometimes, and you see someone driving like a bit of a maniac. Kind of the natural thing is to kind of have a straight away a viewpoint on it, and it's dangerous, they shouldn't do it. But actually, why is that in a similar view, I'm like, why is that person speeding like that, or driving like a maniac? There might be some, I'm not justifying it, but some genuine reason, a really sick family or something that they're trying to get to in an urgent way. I think there's so much to take. There's so much to you spoke about, Roger. I'm just trying to break it down in my own mind, but I think it's like stepping back sometimes when somebody behaves, whether it's a child or an adult, in a certain way, and actually asking that. So, would you say that your staff, if maybe that reference you made to the staff, would you almost expect or see or hear a member of staff almost asking another member of staff why they behave in that way, or an adult ask a child, why would you behave in that, for anyone listening?
Yeah, I think one thing I've learned out of all of this is, you have to start with the grown-ups. You have to create that adult culture in the school that's going to make a difference. But everything that we did with grown-ups works with children, and everything that we've developed with children works with grown-ups. We're all people after all. So it's the same attitudes and behaviours. The professional generosity just becomes generosity when you're working with the children. The professional maturity just becomes a mature attitude. You'll find our children talking about doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, not doing the right thing because they're in fear of the consequence. But to give you an example of how this is developed with the children, I think, when I first arrived at the school, there was a very punitive behaviour policy. One of the things that I think forced away some of the people who decided they didn't want to work with me was the removal of zero tolerance attitudes, non-negotiables, no detentions, no detention room, no punishments. The reason for that is that in my mind, behaviour is no different to a curriculum subject. So if you, say, have a child who comes up to you and says, I don't understand how to do this long division, nobody would think it would be acceptable to stick them at the side of the classroom in a public shaming chair and tell them to work it out for themselves. But putting children on thinking time is exactly that for their behaviour, and we do it all the time. So you need to think of it in terms of how you deal with that behaviour. It's a teaching and learning opportunity. And I always say that one of the challenges I had when I first started was that staff would send children to me if they misbehaved, and I'd have a conversation with the child, and I'd make that relationship with them, and they'd start behaving for me because we built a relationship, and then I'd send them back to the class teacher and they wouldn't behave for them because they hadn't done that. And I'd say to them, if you want them to behave for you, you're going to have that conversation with them. You're going to have to build that relationship. You're going to have to make it work, and then they will start behaving better for you. And another of my favourite phrases is, it's the relationships you build, not the sanctions that you impose, that make the difference. Now, over time, when I first arrived at the school, I used to ask the children when something had not gone well, how they, we talk it through, how it could have been, how it might have looked, what options they got in the future. And then I'd start talking with them once we'd settled it all down and we were in a good, safe, trusting space for a conversation. I would ask them, how do you think what you've done has made me feel? And the idea there was to try and develop the emotional intelligence of the child. And to start with, back in 2005, they would almost certainly say angry, because they were so used to this really authoritarian, non-relationship based, I'm big, you're little, I'm right, you're wrong sort of attitude that they were getting all the time, that they were fearing what the consequence was. And they were in that mindset. And as we developed that over a few years, you'd ask the same question, how do you think what you've done has made me feel? And you'd start getting a different sort of answer. And it wouldn't be to do with fear of consequence. And they'd say, I think you might feel a bit disappointed with me, or I think I might have made you feel a bit sad. And then taking that further, because what you do then is you find as many opportunities when you're dealing with the child. If a child says, I think I've made you feel angry, your response could be, I'm not angry with you. Yeah, what you've done's disappointed me and I didn't expect it. And yeah, that might make me feel a little bit sad, but actually what I am is worried about you. I'm worried about what happened and I want to know why it happened and what we can do to help. And about a couple of years ago now, I think, I had a year 5 young man in my office and he'd done something pretty not nice. And I used the same question again and said to him, how do you think what you've done's made me feel? And he did think about it for about 30 seconds, which is pretty long time for a year 5 kid. And he said, I think you might be a bit worried about me. And I thought, wow, how far have we come? And now I encourage my staff to use that language back with the children to say, whatever their response is, no, I'm not angry with you. Yeah, I might be a little bit saddened and disappointed at what you've done, but actually, I'm worried about you. That works with the children. Our children will now tell you, one of them said in our last inspection, it was quoted in the report, when they were asked why the behaviour in school was so good, one of them said, because we do the right things, because it's the right thing to do. But the other child that was quoted said, because the grown-ups respect us and we respect them back. And so it is all based on relationships. And like I say, what works for adults works for children, works for adults. And it's the whole way that we deal with things in school, that you do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, not because you fear the consequences of doing the wrong thing.
I think that's brilliant. That shift from a young person feeling like they've made you angry to, like you say, worried about it is that's massive, isn't it? It's a huge, and even from an adult's, there's so much to take from that, isn't there? I think that's massive, and from a schooling, I talk about this quite a lot with some awesome senior leaders, and like people forget, I think at times, people think of school as outcomes, grades at the end of a school journey before they move on to the next one. But people, I don't think people appreciate the work that educators, senior leaders, support staff, your caretaker, even everybody within a school community, the work that goes in so many schools around trying to create all round decent human beings. And stuff like, yeah, I just think people forget it sometimes. But there's so
Mm.
much of what you were talking about there, Roger. If I'm honest, I sit listening as a parent of a 10-year-old and 7-year-old, and at times as an adult, I will admit something doesn't quite go to plan as I would expect them to do, and vice versa. You kind of react in a negative way. So there's some absolute nuggets there, if I'm honest, from a parenting side at times from my side, where you've kind of had whatever you've had going on at work during the day, you go home, don't you? And at times, I'll admit, you kind of maybe aren't in the best place to deal with anything that not quite right. So yeah, there's some absolute kind of nuggets in there, I think, for lots of people, myself included.
And some people just, I mean, I would say that at the moment, my style of relationship building in school remains in the minority in terms of school leadership and management. But one thing that I do not like at all, and I will always be calling out, is zero tolerance policies. Zero tolerance policies, and particularly, not exclusively, but more likely to be used in secondary schools, where it's perceived that a relational approach to behaviour management is harder to put in place. Well, I know you can do it with younger children, and I know you can do it with grown-ups, so I don't see why it can't happen with the group in the middle that are teenagers. And I get the whole brain growth and imbalance of teenage years, and the fact that we don't actually get a proper settled brain until we're in our mid-20s, because things happen at different times in our brains and different bits grow, and that's why we have teenage behaviour as it is. But it's hard work embedding all of this stuff, but I've got to say that once it's there, your life is so much easier. It really is. So, I mean, here's the thing about zero tolerance policies that struck me the other day, that I did stick on LinkedIn, and I think it's probably relevant saying it. If you just bear with me. So I think what I wrote was something along the lines of looking at the legal system, and a judge's role is to uphold the laws. And we all have rules in schools, and the adult's role is to uphold the rules and maintain the boundaries. I mean, just because it's relational education doesn't mean it hasn't got boundaries, and children need boundaries for security. They need to know what the expectations are. They need to have that, like I've said, agreement, that consensus of what the right thing to do is, so that we can uphold it. But in a court of law, the judges don't make the rules, but they do interpret the sentence. And by interpreting the sentence, they take into account all kinds of mitigation, which usually includes particularly difficult personal circumstances, expressions of remorse, those sort of things. Now, only when a judge has considered all of those things, all of those factors in a court of law, can they provide an appropriate sentence. And if they haven't considered all those factors, that sentence can be overturned. Yeah. Now, in schools, we've got many schools that actually celebrate zero tolerance policies on their website. A zero tolerance policy is the antithesis of inclusion, because it doesn't allow a context to be, referred to at all. If you do this, that'll happen. Doesn't matter what the context was, do this, that'll happen. Bring a vape into school, suspended for a day or 2 days, those sort of things, yeah? No context at all. And I find it abhorrent that children are deprived of their education and actually put at risk by not being in school sometimes, for those kind of decisions that often, I think, are made, not always, but often, probably too frequently, are made because it's the easy thing for the adults. You could even call it the professionally lazy thing for the adults, rather than being in the interests of the child. And I just ask that if the zero tolerance policy only focuses on the whats and deny the opportunity to explore the whys, and if the denial of contextualisation isn't acceptable in a court of law, why do we allow it to happen in our schools?
Man, that's a great question, isn't it? It's a great question, and
yeah, we're treating children
yeah.
in a way that we wouldn't tolerate treating grown-ups. for doing
Yeah, well,
something wrong.
you know, as an employer, you can't, you can't, if I as an employer to our internal team and then our kind of contracting staff who work in schools, if things happen in people's lives, and if you had a zero tolerance kind of standpoint on staffing, probably wouldn't have any staff. Would be
Yeah.
my view. So yeah, I mean. Yes, it's a great question, and one that I imagine will promote quite a lot of conversation around.
It's intended to. It really is.
Yeah,
I think we need to talk about it,
absolutely.
and I'm happy to talk to anybody about any of this stuff. You know, I have colleagues who tell me, and again, I'm not putting a blame on my secondary school colleagues at all for this, but I do hear it a lot, which is it's what you don't understand, Roger, is it's all about crowd control. And I just think, well, if you get the relationships right, it doesn't have to be about crowd control, you know? And if you get the relationships right, then you're doing it because you're looking beyond the actions of the child and you're looking at the, again, I come back to, you're looking at the whys rather than just responding to the whats.
Yeah,
And I think
that,
in our workplaces, you know, as managers, it doesn't matter whether we're school leaders or we're managers in companies or whatever, we know that we will have a variety of different members of staff, all individual, all have their own nuances. If they're doing a good job for us, then we will put up with their nuances. You know, we'll actually, you know what, celebrate our differences, as long as it's all working for the common good. And I don't see that as being different in school dealing with children. It's not one size fits all.
no, yeah, I agree with you, to be quite honest. Yeah, from a school point of view and a workplace point of view, you know, walk of life, sports team, we're just society. Yeah,
Well, you say that though. That phrase I use, the greatest barriers to inclusive education reside in our own minds. Just change the word education to society. The greatest barriers to inclusive society reside in our own minds.
yeah, but it's such a, it's such a, inclusion, well-being, those two words are bounded around so much sometimes, aren't they? And yeah, I don't really know. I don't think everybody really, myself, learn things about inclusion and well-being all the time. I'll
Yeah.
openly admit, and I want to keep learning about it. But I think there's lots that think they understand what inclusion means, but maybe don't really.
Well, I'm always learning. You know, go back to my college days when I was doing my teacher training and learning about the social constructivist views of Vygotsky and Bruner, and the idea that the conversation, the outcome of the conversation is greater than the sum of its parts. Absolutely, you know, believe in that, completely believe in that. But also, one of the reasons that I enjoy having the conversation so much is that, just like those social constructivists said, every time that you have a conversation about something and you're expressing what your beliefs are, you're reinforcing them in your own head.
Mm.
So the more of those conversations you have, the more you're able to reflect and challenge yourself and refine your ideas, and the more you're able to, I think, secure your beliefs. If you just go with one narrow view and you aren't prepared to discuss it, then yeah, that's a challenge. You know,
Mm.
that's a problem, I'd say. And I think I'm pleased at the moment that we have an opportunity with a change of administration that I haven't heard the word woke used for a while when we've been talking about this stuff. And it was really, I had the feeling that it was just an easy way out of a conversation for somebody who didn't have the inclination or possibly didn't have the intellect to debate it. and talk about it or even engage with it. Just write it off as woke and you don't even have to think about it or listen to it. But we're not getting that at the moment. So we're able to have these conversations about maybe doing things in a different way. And I think that's reassuring.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. Do you feel like you're because again, like some of the kind of posts that you post on LinkedIn, for example, are great. Do you have you have you had many other colleagues from different schools over the kind of period of you being in your role kind of reach out for how you've created the environment you've created? Is it?
It's interesting. Uh, about 5 years ago, my local authority asked me if I would chair something called the SEMH workstream, um, because they were looking for somebody that wasn't a central local authority person to do it. Didn't have to be me, it just had to be somebody I think that wasn't town hall based, so they could take a fresh view and maybe not worry about looking over their shoulders in terms of town hall politics or what their boss was thinking. And we got a lot done. We created an inclusion pledge for the borough. We rewrote the SEMH handbook and we rewrote the SEMH banded document. We got all of that stuff done. And that was under my leadership on that group. And I was really proud and really pleased when the local authority called me into the town hall and said, yeah, we want to take this on and we want to put it out there and we want to use it for our whole borough. This is at the same time, although I wasn't aware of it, that the likes of Maureen McKenna were putting together and others at the London VIU were putting together the London Inclusion Charter, which launched last year. And so it was definitely of a time that we were building up to being ready for this stuff happening. Now, I think that it was about a year ago, because I've never been on any social media ever. I don't know, no Facebook, no Twitter, no nothing. It's never really interested me. And one of my colleagues, the borough, wonderful lady called Sharon White, who I think you spoke to about a week ago. Yeah. She was working as the inclusion lead for the borough at the time, and then she left to do other things, very successfully. I'm very pleased for her. She said to me, you've got some great ideas, you need to get them out there. And I said, well, how do you do that? And she said, why don't you go on LinkedIn? And I said, no, I just don't do social media. I'm not into people sending me videos of cats that are scared of cucumbers and stuff like that. And she said, no, it's not like that. It's not like that. It's much more professional. And she said, you do get some people on there that are a little bit, just want to sell your stuff or do whatever. But she said it's an opportunity for a professional conversation with lots of other people and link lots of ideas. So I got on there last year in March, end of March. And I think for the first few months, I had about 40 connections. It's people I could have picked the phone up. They're going, I knew them all. I could have just gone and walked up the road and knocked on their door. But that's what happens. And then I started putting a few tentative bits out there. And then I thought, do you know what? We're coming into an Ofsted window. We haven't been inspected for a while. I'm expecting the phone call any day. It's not happened yet this morning, but who knows? And why don't I just say what I really feel about the school? We've got this tagline, which is high aspirations and a shared passion for learning, and that's absolutely right. That's what we should maintain all the time. But it's not really what the school means. It's not really what we're doing. So I decided to it was about second week in August, and I just went on the website and changed the tagline. And the tagline now says, an emotionally available school, everyone is welcome, everyone belongs. And I put that as a thing on LinkedIn. Guess what I've just done? And it was astonishing. It was astonishing how that got picked up. It was massive. And people were saying, what do you mean by emotionally available school? And so I said emotionally available adults. What's an emotionally available adult then? And so I put a bullet point list together, a bit like the one I was telling you about earlier. Then somebody said, okay, that sounds really good. I'm going to put that list up on my staff room wall and we can all do it. And I kind of went, whoa, no, hang on a minute. You can't just stick a list of bullet points up and expect your staff to do it. You've got to build the culture. It's quite a lot of hard work and quite a lot goes into it. So then I started expanding on it by doing a little bit of a blog about the journey. And then somebody asked me if I do a podcast. And then somebody asked me if I do a webinar. And then you're asking me to do another podcast as well. And I've got another webinar coming up in April. And I've been contacted by an inclusion team in the West Country for a county who have asked me if I'd be happy to talk to them. I've been contacted by somebody in Liverpool. I've been contacted by somebody in Manchester, Gloucestershire. It's just snowballed. And like I say, I started the summer break last year with something like 40 or 50 connections. I think I've got a following of just over 1,900 now as of this morning. So it's quite amazing that you I don't know. It took my breath away. It really took my breath away that something I put on there just suddenly went woomph, and now everybody wants to know about it. And I was really privileged that I got asked to go to Parliament last week on Tuesday for the launch of the Traveller Movements report, Fought Not Taught, which is a really important piece of work that highlights disenfranchisement of one of our most disenfranchised communities in education and society. So this has all come from Sharon saying to me, you ought to get on LinkedIn. But it's just snowballed. And yes, people want to talk about it.
I think it's on point for so many people. When there's a recruitment retention crisis, if you like, and pupils have such varied needs in every corner of the country. I think it's absolutely on point. I just love the concept of looking at your staffing team first and making sure that they're all emotionally available first, and then go out to the pupils. I think that's and that it's not you're right, it's not putting some bullet points up on the staff room. There's a lot of work gone into that to make that happen, but I just think it's absolutely on point. So I kind of think you'll get much more traction to come from it. There will always be those who think that the zero tolerance policy is their way, and hopefully through things like this and some more kind of postings and webinars that people like yourself are doing, we can hopefully reduce that number in time. So I think I kind of commend you for what you've done, to be honest, Roger.
I'd really like to give you just a little anecdote as well, if you don't mind, that I think sort of sums up the whole importance of looking at the whys rather than the whats, understanding the reasons. So in the inclusion pledge that we produced for the local authority, there are 9 values. Value number 4 says language is a powerful means of communication, and the way that we use it directly impacts on the outcomes of our interactions. Yeah, sounds pretty straightforward, doesn't it? If it's back to that professional generosity. Somebody snaps at you, it makes you feel in a sort of way, doesn't it? So hopefully they don't snap at you. But if they do snap at you, it's not what happens, it's the way you deal with it that makes the difference. Yeah. So way back when I first started, I think I just finished my first term. It was January 2006. Yeah, I've been acting head teacher for a term at the school, and it was about 7:45 in the morning, and I was at the end of the year 5-6 building corridor, and at the other end of the corridor the playground door slammed open, and Tony, who's one of our most challenging pupils at the time, was rushing into the building. And up that end of the corridor, classroom door opened because the teacher had heard the slamming of the playground door, and out stepped one of the year 6 teachers. And the teacher saw Tony rushing down the corridor and shouted out, "What do you think you're doing in here at this time, boy?" And Tony turns back and says, "Why don't you just right off?" And turns around and runs back in the playground. And the teacher turns and sees me approaching him, and goes a little bit on the defensive and says, "Did you hear that? Did you hear what he just said to me? You need to exclude him for that." And my response at the time, and again, I don't know where it came from out of my head, but it just came straight out, was, to be honest, if you'd approached me in that way, I might well have responded to you in a similar manner. But I'll see you about that later. And right now I'm going to find Tony. And I did find Tony, and he did agree, thankfully, to come and sit in the comfy chair in my office while I got him some work, and he calmed down. And it took a while for him to calm down. But when he was ready to talk about it, a fuller picture emerged. And if that teacher had approached the situation in a different way, like, "Hello, Tony, you're in early. You're looking for someone, can I help?" Then they would have found out that Tony's estranged father had turned up at his house the previous night, badly beaten up his mum. The police had arrested Dad. His mum was in hospital, but he didn't know how badly hurt she was. He spent the night on his aunt's sofa, and he didn't know where his baby sister was. And Tony was in school early because he was desperate to find his teacher, who was one of the safest and most trusted adults in his life at that point. And he expected the school to be a secure and safe place for him. And it only took one teacher to intervene with a single sentence to completely undermine everything that Tony needed and rightly expected right there and right then from his school. And I found out later that there's plenty of research to show that 90% of instances where there's a major confrontation between a pupil and an adult in the school, the situation has been triggered and or escalated by the grown-up. And that is why we deal with things the way we deal with them, because if you respond to the what without asking about the why, you're going to build a barrier between yourself and the child, and they're going to be let down, and they're going to have that emotional rug pulled out from underneath them at the time they need it most. And I think it was Russell Barkley, and I don't know if I get this accurate, but it said something along the lines of, "The children who need love the most will always ask for it in the least loving of ways."
I think, yeah. Well, Roger, I think that's a perfect place to finish our pod, and I would like to add to that, for anyone who's listening to this recording, the next time a young person or an adult acts in a particular way, like Tony did that day at school, just maybe step back and kind of think, what could we have done differently, or why is that person behaving in that sort of way? So, Tony, I hope wherever you are now, life is going well for you. And Roger, I'm sure you've have played a massive part in lots of young people's lives, and will continue to do so. Thank you for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for the opportunity. It's been great.